Thanks. So tonight we're welcoming Dawn Post to our Monday evening speaker series. Dawn is a child advocate and civil rights attorney who's spent her career standing up for young people impacted by the adoption and the foster care system. She's the founder of Themis Youth Law and Advocacy, an organization that works to protect the rights of youth who have been adopted, institutionalized, or failed by the systems that are meant to care for them. Dawn will be discussing adoption promises broken, legal and policy failures impacting abandoned adoptees here with us this evening. And with that, I give you Dawn.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak with you all and to be able to share some of the work that I've been doing and some of my thoughts, particularly around the law and the practice as it relates to abandoned adoptees. Just as a brief introduction of myself, I actually decided I was going to be a lawyer for children when I was 10. And that was, I grew up in the state of Maine, very unconventional, living off the land, and read a lot of Perry Mason. And even though I had no TV, and decided I was, after a high profile fatality that occurred in the state that I heard about over the radio, decided that if that child had had a lawyer, they might have survived. And that was a foster care situation. And so I actually dropped out of high school at 16 to go to college because I wanted to speed my journey up. So this is, my very much a chosen career path and one that I am incredibly passionate about. And so and lawyers, there aren't even lawyers for children in Maine. However, I ended up beginning my career in New York City because that's a very robust attorney for the child programming where every child is assigned a lawyer in foster care from 0 to 21 if they have extended foster care. And then also in high profile, high conflict custody and visitation cases as well. And that's discretionary. And so I have worked in a variety of ways, working with directly youth who have experienced foster care and trauma and adoption and custody and guardianship. And out of that, because I was a director of some of these nonprofits, I would oftentimes be in citywide meetings where everyone's talking about how do we make adoptions faster? And this was back in 2010. And that's all anyone wanted to talk about. And that's, of course, because of the pressure of ASFA. And so it was like, let's put baby booties on every child, on the court documents who have not yet been adopted, things like that. And I was saying, we all know children are returning to the system after they've been adopted. Why aren't we talking about making adoptions better? And people were really reluctant to talk about that. And so I ended up deciding to write a law review article and really did a deep dive into children who were being returned to family court. And that was published in 2011. It's called The Revolving Doors of Family Court. And it's on my personal website. And it talked about looking at every area of family court, whether it was delinquency, whether it was child welfare, whether it was guardianship and custody or visitation, how children were returning to family court. And so I ran a study in my office where we looked at guardianships, and out of 50 cases, 75% of the youth that had to have new guardians was due to the death or infirmity of an adoptive parent. And that was because we had a 71-year-old who adopted a 9-year-old, a 66-year-old who adopted an infant. And even though there are promises made about being able to have backup resources, those backup resources, that's not a legally binding commitment. And so they were not necessarily stepping forward when that occurred. Not only that, another law firm in New York City ran a study and they did a manual hand count, and they do a lot of voluntary placement agreements, voluntarily placing the child back in foster care. And out of 1,000 children, 200 of them were adoptees who had been returned to family court on voluntary placement agreements. That was 1/5 of their entire caseload. And I also collaborated with Covenant House New York City, and they estimated that they were seeing 120 children per year that were under the age of 18 who had been put out of their adoptive homes and were seeking support from Covenant House. And so I saw this as an opportunity to be able to try to create some systemic reform and change. And so we began having a lot of conversations. It felt very, very repetitive. But within a few years, we got a lot of buy-in. And in addition, we also did a lot of work around post-adoption sibling visitation. So I had a separate law review article that was published about that. And all of this, in addition, with respect to the broken adoption work that I was doing at that time, I began focus on what I call adoption subsidy misuse. And that is, and many of you might realize that if you're familiar, if you're entrenched in the child welfare system, is that the adoption subsidy is very difficult to cut off. And many states will not actually terminate the subsidy, even if the child is back in foster care. And that is due to some ambiguity in the statute and with respect to the actual the guidance that the federal government sends out. And so all of these youth that had been returned to foster care, their subsidy was still continuing to be paid out. And we would see sibling groups that all three were returned to foster care, and then an enormous amount of money would continue to be paid out to adoptive parents who were not planning and had no contact with their adopted children. And so we put forward legislation on that issue, and it just passed in 2024, and we're the first state, New York, to do that. And I have also attempted various ways to get the federal government to do a better job in terms of tracking this or being able to respond to it effectively. But this is an issue across the country. It's not just New York. It's really the way that the federal guidance is, because there's no legal definition of what support is. And so you could give a card or a pair of socks, and that could be considered support to justify keeping the subsidy on. Or arguably, the adoptive parent would say, well, I'm keeping a home available, so if they ever leave foster care, they'd have a home to return to. So there were quite a few issues that I've been working on over the years. And in 2024, I had stepped away from the trenches, so to speak, and direct advocacy work. As you all know, there's really high burnout and it's really taxing, and was doing more consulting and teaching. And I'm ashamed to say that despite my work around broken adoptions, I had not realized how many adopted youth were being institutionalized after they had been adopted. I certainly have been a part of class action lawsuits where we had sued states for their over-reliance of institutional care. And so I had always viewed the troubled teen industry as somewhat separate, and viewed it more, and this was naive of me, of being a more middle-class white kid kind of problem, kids getting sent away. And I did not and I also, because of the demographics in New York of who's adopting, didn't realize how many people, with more means, where they would use that to warehouse and institutionalize adopted children after they had been adopted. And so in 2024, I was contacted because there was 7 boys that were removed from an abusive facility in Jamaica, and 3 of them were adoptees. And their adoptive families allegedly were not planning for their return to the US. And so after I had spoken to the embassy and determined that that seemed to be true, I actually, on my dime, went and for 3 weeks worked on the ground in Jamaica to try to facilitate the return of these boys to their state child welfare systems or to other proposed guardians. And I cannot explain how complicated and difficult this was, because none of the state systems would pay attention. Essentially, it was, they're out of our jurisdiction. We no longer have responsibility for them. Even though I would argue, well, the abandonment is taking place in your state because that's where the decision is happening. And it really, after 3 weeks, was unable to get anywhere, and this was after almost 60 days of all the boys being in the foster care system in Jamaica. And so what ended up happening is, after they were in foster care in Jamaica for 60 days, they were then placed in the permanent custody of Jamaica because of abandonment. And so I continued to work with those boys after I returned to the US to help facilitate their return. And the last boy returned in last September, and Jamaica deported him because they were so frustrated that no one would take responsibility over these young people. And the fact that I was in meetings at that time, and believe me, I was in contact with the State Department, ACF, Children's Bureau, everyone in the universe. And we were talking about returning them through ORR, which is the Office of Refugee and Resettlement, as if they were stateless and citizenless, that they were not actual American children. And, the fact that we were even talking about that, I think shows how many gaps exist in the system and how little accountability there was. And so while I was in Jamaica, I learned of another facility there that houses approximately 160 to 180 adoptees. And these are American adoptees that have been sent to Jamaica to this facility purportedly for the treatment of reactive attachment disorder. And for anyone who knows, of course, there's going to be attachment issues. And certainly I'm not as well versed in attachment theory as a psychologist might be. But the diagnosis is coming from more lay people and not necessarily from the professionals that I would consider to be real experts in this area. And so what I started seeing and what I started hearing about were adoptees that were getting very quickly turned around and sent to this facility in Jamaica and that facility has ties to a facility in the US that was closed for the torture of children. And so allegedly what happened is that they left and they reopened in the Caribbean because there's no licensing, there's no oversight, and there's no regulation. And so even though these are considered treatment, they're being warehoused, and a lot of abuses are happening, pretty horrific abuses, in fact. And so I'm aware of at least 3 little ones that were left there when they were 7 years old. One was an international adoptee, and so she ended up being autistic. And so rather than working with her and her needs, the adoptive family within a year just dropped her off at this facility, and she's been there almost 9 years. And an incredibly and to the point she's had no contact with her adoptive family, and so allegedly has taken on the last name of the director of the program. So I, at that moment, saw a real need for a nonprofit law firm to be able to help not only the 3 original abandoned adoptees that I was working with, but others that were experiencing this. So I began moving more into what I would call the troubled teen industry space. And so I was actually shocked to learn that at a minimum, we're looking at probably 30%. There's very few studies, but the few studies exist show at least 30% of the population of the troubled teen youth are adoptees. And everyone I've ever interviewed, whether they were an adoptee or not, has always said that a significant number, if not the majority of other teens in their program, were adoptees. And I am working with a reporter where we've actually identified 123 facilities in and outside of the US that market themselves towards the treatment of reactive attachment disorder and for adoptees. So I think that the numbers might actually be much higher. If there were therapeutic practices that were occurring, and if there was mental health treatment and this type of thing, I think that, and if the adoptive family was planning on the return of the child, I can see value in some of this. But the fact that these seem to be really about warehousing and about just keeping them out of the adoptive family's hair until they're 18. And then at 18, they're saying, okay, make it, figure it out on your own, because that's exactly what's happening. that's an entirely different issue. And so the survivors that I'm working with who are out of this other program in Jamaica where there's almost 180, they are actually, and if there's anyone on Florida here, I really hope you pay attention to this. What's happening is when they turn 18, so there's allegations of labor and sex trafficking. And if they can make enough money to make their way back to the US, then they are getting a ticket to Florida, to Fort Lauderdale, and because that's the closest port of entry. Or even if their adoptive family is willing to pay for the ticket, they are just getting a ticket back to Florida. And so we're seeing a lot of abandoned adoptees who are landing back in the US after years of institutionalization, no education, no life skills, no social skills. And they are pretty quickly getting picked up and exploited and trafficked. And so I'm working with a number of young people where I am trying to get them safe housing, trying to get their state. For example, this one young lady I was recently worked with was an Arizona adoptee. And so I contacted Arizona Child Welfare to see if they would be able to assist. And it was a very quick no, because she was not adopted as a teenager. So she didn't fall within that small group of post-adoption support and where you can access certain services. And every state's very different. And so I have really struggled in finding a trafficking program that would be able to assist her. And this was after a year of her doing survival sex because she also doesn't trust institutions or figures in, traditional institutional care because that's where she was trafficked in. And so this is a lot of complicated issues that and youth that have experienced a lot of trauma and abandonment who are, recently I spoke to one young lady who came out of this program. Her adoptive parents bought her a ticket to Hawaii. And you would think, well, that sounds amazing. Who wouldn't want to live Hawaii? They bought her a ticket to Hawaii because it was the furthest point away from them. And these are not young people who I would say had gross behaviors that would necessitate that kind of, absolute abandonment and lack of familial connection. These are youth that, in my experience, have their trauma has often been misunderstood. It's not been treated. At times, they are adopted by parents who are very much in very fundamentalist Christian backgrounds. So any form of disrespect was immediately punished. Or if a child was exploring their identity, and this was particularly of transracial adoptees, then what would happen is that they would view that as very threatening, that any exploration of Black identity, Black music, this type of thing. And so, and it all happens around adolescence, right? And so when they hit adolescence, that's when they were saying, or they perceived these young Black boys as threatening, which was another dynamic. Also coming out as LGBTQ, a lot of youth were being sent into Jamaica for that reasons. And I must point out that Jamaica has very strict anti-sodomy laws. And when you're dealing with an all Jamaican staff in a very religious facility, that also, is a form of conversion therapy and abuses. And I almost call it abuse by proxy because you are sending children and young people to facilities knowing that they may undergo very extreme isolation, food deprivation, physical punishment, emotional punishment. These kids cannot look at each other. They cannot talk to each other. There's one young lady who everyone has told me about that was in isolation for so long that everyone forgot that she existed. They thought she had been sent home. And so when they brought her out of isolation after 7 or 8 months, the girls were shocked. And so these are incredibly serious issues that are occurring with these adoptees. And I would say approximately 50% are international and 50% are domestic. And I've been very disappointed since I've started the nonprofit that I've been able to get attention to these issues, to this population. And it's not just this facility, there's many more in the US. I just posted something on social media today because the Northeast is having a heat wave, and middle of the US is having a heat wave. And there's a facility in Missouri that has what I call coffin beds. And so I posted a photo of that one of my clients had sent me. And so they're working on the farm and sleeping in these coffin beds, which are very reminiscent of the slave ship holds, where you have to, or a morgue where you have to slide your feet in to get in. And they have, very basic care there, so there's not going to be any air. And so I wonder whether or not we'll see any injuries as a result of that. So I'm working with young people all across the US, but right now my focus has been very much on this institution in Jamaica that has so many adoptees. And I actually anticipate within the next couple of months that there'll be um, that there'll be some explosive news around this, which then causes me to wonder, if this facility closes, what's going to happen to these 180 kids, particularly if their adoptive parents have had no contact with them for years or just don't want to have contact? Because what I learned out of the initial 3 that I worked with who had been removed from Atlanta's Leadership Academy is that there was no accountability in the state, federal, county systems when it came to the adoptive parents, and that no one wanted to take responsibility for them. And Jamaica, I very much doubt, is going to take them into foster care. They can't. I think that we almost broke the system just with the 7 that they took into foster care, because it's such a, we took a lot of resources away from Jamaican kids that they were never reimbursed for. And so I have a feeling that they'll be deported. And so then closest port of entry is going to be Florida. And Florida, I've tried very hard to get child welfare to start thinking about this. And I would encourage any state really needs to be thinking about this. And Ohio, there are a few that came from Ohio. Is the state or child welfare systems going to take responsibility if the adoptive parents have warehoused them and no longer want them in their home? Or will they at least check to make sure the child's okay if and when they come back to the US? So there's a lot happening right now in my investigation and the work that I'm doing. With the development of Themis Youth Law and Advocacy, I did it so, and Themis stands for the goddess of justice, and I named it that for obvious reasons, but, and also just very quickly, because I wanted to get it done while I was in Jamaica. But, I did it because the need was so great and it was so immediate. However, I did it without funding. So I have funded the entire last year of my work with my 401k. And so I'm currently seeking grants and currently seeking financial support from others. But this, I'm very committed to making sure that we can continue this work. But I will say that it's been very difficult. And so I appreciate everyone here who has come forward to think about and talk about these issues, because what happens legally when adoptive parents desert or institutionalize adoptees? And the answer is nothing. And I don't know if anyone else here is in the court systems, but even when it comes to pretty extreme abuse cases, it's disappointing that no one wants to bring a case against adoptive parents. And it almost seems like they'll say, well, we'll give a pass, because we asked you to take this on and maybe it was too much, so we can't hold you accountable for that. Or I think there's somewhat of an issue in the fact that you have state systems who may have approved that home who are now investigating whether or not there was an abandonment. And so by way of example, a child that I was working with, a 15-year-old, had been adopted since she was an infant. I was begging, and this was in New York, her adoptive parent to take her back. And we were all sitting together in the meeting. And she looked at me and said, "What do you expect? She just has bad genes." And so then when I went to the ACS attorney and said, well, if this was a bio parent who abandoned them, there would be a neglect charge and you would be bringing this to court, they said, well, what do you expect? She's crazy, referring to the child. And so I think that there's a real gap in terms of what accountability is present. And I think that there needs to be more. But for adoptees, there's no due process, there's no permanent guardianship planning, there's no legal representation. Even their US citizenship may become an issue if, in fact, their paperwork was never completed properly as an international adoptee. And so I think that, you know, in New York, for example, we're great about saying, all right, you all have an attorney until the adoption is finalized. But what happens after? And none of these youth have access to anyone to make sure that they are protected and that their rights are protected. And particularly when they are sent outside of the US, or and this is true actually in the US, when they're placed in programs, guardianship is or custody is given to the program. And so I ran into a situation where I went to Jamaica on a third trip last year with court orders with a guardian to take the child out of the facility. And Jamaica refused, that facility refused to obey the court order. They will not obey US court orders, and they said this explicitly. And so that would mean that if anyone wants to try to assist these young people or take guardianship of them, they would have to go through a Jamaican court for an American child because guardianship has been signed over to the program. And so that has been another complicating factor. I think that there is also the policy gaps that help enable this is continued receipt of federal and state adoption funds. And so, for example, as I talked about earlier, the adoption subsidy, well, you would think, well, people aren't making money off of that. But when you adopt a lot of kids and you're only paying $2,000 a month, but you're getting $4,000 a month in subsidy, then, you know, they can afford why they're leaving the child in Jamaica where it's cheaper. And there is also, I think, an issue of state systems who are also helping subsidize this. And so one of my recent investigations has to do with California, where I learned that even though AB 153, a recent piece of legislation, does not allow foster children to be sent out of state to places like Utah, where almost 200 plus troubled teen facilities exist, because there were so many abuses that occurred. And so there was a big push to bring all the children back. There was this law that was passed that you cannot use those funds to be able to house foster kids out of the state in these facilities. What I learned was that as soon as the child's adopted, they're using adoption assistance program funds, AAP program funds, the counties are, to fund these placements out of state in these institutions where abuses have been found, up to $17,000 per month, which is very concerning. And so that's just one example where you may see not only the financial with respect to individual subsidies, but also how state systems are also contributing to these issues and allowing adoptees to be institutionalized without due process and without any care. Because if you're being warehoused till you're 18, and there may be some very good placements here, but the ones that I'm investigating are not. And it just seems ironic to me that you have a state that has said so clearly, we cannot protect foster children in these placements, but okay, we'll pay for adopted children to be there up to $17,000 a month and continue to pay the subsidy to the adoptive parent who no longer cares for that child. And that can go up to for years. So I think that there's also a significant issue with lack of centralized tracking or data collection around this issue. I led, because this has been a big focus over the last decade, I led efforts in 2014, 2015 for it to be added as a data point in AFCARs. And so that AFCAR, and that's the federal data set that captures what states are doing. And And so broken adoptions was successfully added as a data point in 2015 with a plan by 2017 to be implemented. However, we obviously had a change in administration. This was at the same time that there was also a data point that was to be added for LGBTQ youth. And so there was a lot of pushback around that. And so all of that was delayed. And this was only implemented in the last couple of years. And so the first data just came out just in May for 2 years ago, and it doesn't contain the information that's needed. However, and so it's disappointing that because I do believe that greater transparency around this and an actual counting of how many youth are returning to foster care or other avenues could be incredibly helpful. But we don't have that information, because if we remain uninformed, then everyone will say, well, it's not that big of a problem. And when I truly believe that it is. And 2 years ago, I worked with a USA Today reporter, and they did an incredible deep data dive into the AFCAR's data systems that they had at that time, or the data sets that they had at that time. And they calculated, and it was a long series, that 12 children per day are returned to foster care, based upon the AFCAR's data set that they were looking at. Now, mind you, this was based upon data's only as good as what's inputted. And this was also before this was an official data point. So I think it's a severe underestimation of what number of children who have been adopted are being returned to foster care. So I think that that is a significant issue that we need greater transparency and numbers around to be able to effectively determine where we need to make changes. And also I think it would be really, and I made this recommendation years ago in New York, that we should have a broken adoptions review board to be able to say, why did the adoption break down, so that we can see if we can make changes for future adoptions, because we would seeing a lot of the same issues. I think that there's a lot of inadequate federal oversight of adoption dissolution. And I should say that there's a lot of confusion over language. But if you ever hear the word dissolution, that's a legal termination of parental rights. In my experience, it does not happen that often with adoptive parents, so you're not going to see high numbers of it. So when people say it doesn't happen much, they're looking at dissolutions, not necessarily the fact that children may be in the guardianship of someone else, or homeless or on the streets, or institutionalized. And I think that there's also a big issue with what was called rehoming after the Megan Twohey article in 2013, which was particularly around international adoptees. We saw a lot of articles about kids that were being just transferred to other people's guardianship, and really horrific things that happened to them. And so this is all very much under the radar. There's certainly, and so I think there needs to be greater protection for youth through the court systems at a minimum, and others, to ensure that that doesn't happen. I think there's also an absence of trauma-informed post-adoption services, or not enough post-adoption services. However, I will say in my experience that oftentimes when adoptive parents reach the point where they're calling anyone, it's to get rid of the child, and they have no interest in even trying to keep the child in their home. So it's a little late in terms of trying to put in any kind of supportive services into the home. So the real world impact of all of this is, the institutionalize of young people, the pipeline that they end up into homelessness, into trafficking, into exploitation, perhaps into prison. And almost all of the youth I'm working with now are homeless, or are couch surfing. So it's very insecure, and are food insecure. So I've been paying emergency needs on emergency cases in terms of getting them food, or paying for a hotel room to get them out of their trafficking situation, or a flight to get them to a different state when they've been in Florida. So the voices of the adoptees, I think, are incredibly important to hear from and listen from. Unfortunately, my experience has been in contacting systems or adoption agencies or adoption attorneys to talk about these things is that they view it as and brings me back to what it felt like in 2010 when I began work on this, is no one wanted to talk about it because the focus is on getting kids adopted or getting more kids adopted. So they don't want to talk about how it's failing. Yet I truly, truly believe and really would like to see more emphasis on the fact of accountability, that if we are helping facilitate these adoptions, we should be present for these adoptees when they are put out and abandoned and are struggling. And I have found no one who, or very few people who are really willing to have those conversations. They automatically assume I'm anti-adoption, which actually is not true. I've, been an attorney for children in some really wonderful, open adoption and other adoption situations. But my experience has been, and obviously I'm hearing all the bad stories because that's the clients that I represent, is that there's just so many issues that they're not receiving assistance for. And again, I must emphasize a lot of it was just normal adolescent behavior that ended up getting pathologized, and which I also just want to highlight that the issues of race and disability and sexuality also play a huge component in the client population that I'm working with. So I believe that there are legal remedies. I've started circulating amongst policy people in DC, various thoughts that I have or recommendations. By no means am I an expert. I've been able to help, lead teams and in changes of legislation in New York. However, I find it mind numbing and certainly have never been able to write it myself. But it is a difficult process, but so necessary. But I do believe that there needs to be federal oversight over many of these issues, more citizen protection for intercountry adoption, more trauma-informed post-adoption services and support, and more money that's geared towards that, and more reporting around all of these issues. And because we touch upon not just return to foster care, but also guardianships, then we should not allow facilitation of transfer of custody without legal orders. There should, because some states will allow you just to sign a paper, that there needs to be greater advocacy and protection, because we have promised these vulnerable youth, this is what you can expect. You've met your forever home. You're now in a forever placement. And so often they've just been disappointed over and over again. And so and what I will do is add on to any email that is sent out after this, some of my ideas or thoughts, some of the memos that I've prepared in case you want to take it anywhere. But I think that these are significant issues that not enough people are talking about. And so I welcome the opportunity to have conversations around these issues so that we're not just writing off these young people and, abandoning them when they've been abandoned by every other system so far. So that's just a very quick synopsis of everything that I'm working on right now. But I'm happy to take on some questions. I saw that some were coming through, but I wasn't reading them.
I think I captured them, but thank you, Don. I'm so grateful for your work and your attention to all these issues. It's really incredible, the commitment. And I know this is just the tip of the iceberg, but so my head is spinning this, I felt like, we should have had a major trigger warning, right? We're all
Oh, I'm
probably,
sorry. I always
no,
try
that's
to
okay.
lead with that. And because
hopefully people realize that when they register just from reading the
yeah.
description, but it is overwhelming. So I commend you for, whatever armor you wear every day to be able to make it through and
Well, I will
have
say
an
there are
impact.
successes. I was just with a client here in a local fundraiser, and so she took her last GED exam while she was with me. And this is 3 years in the making. So she was left Jamaica at 18, was abandoned, and has been waking her way, and she passed it. And so the scream of, I'm finally a high school diploma. Yeah, I finally got my high school diploma, or she got her driver's permit, is just so amazing. So there are these small successes and joy in some of the work that I do, that offsets it to some degree.
Yeah, keeps you going. So I wrote down some notes and I copied all the questions that were in the chat. So one question that I had just listening to you, and you kind of mentioned this near the end, but is this kind of rehoming 2.0? Do you feel like, rehoming got, publicized and uncovered and it wasn't okay anymore and there was pushback? And
Well,
so then this
yeah.
is like an offshoot or an outgrowth of that?
I don't, in the sense that when I started talking about broken adoptions, I was actually very frustrated about all the talk about rehoming, because that was the focus on intercountry adoptees. And so I had met with Megan Toohey at that time, and because I was looking at domestic, obviously, because I'm child welfare and foster care based. And so I was trying to shift the focus and say, yes, this is happening and we see this publicly, but this is also happening with domestic adoptees and we need to pay attention and do more. And and I actually start the law review article talking about that specifically. I think that it just ebbs and flows and that the attention went elsewhere and that it's always been happening. And this institutionalization, I think that unfortunately there's a lot of stigma around adopted youth, that they must come with all of these problems and behavioral health issues and mental health issues. And so there's almost, well, maybe they're better off wherever they are without knowing the circumstances that they're in and these really incredibly abusive and neglectful facilities that they're placed in. Many of them are because there are some states that don't have same licensing and regulation, Missouri. And so if you are a religious program, there are a lot of exemptions that allow you to escape oversight. And so when I said the coffin beds, that is one of those programs that I just posted about today. And so I think that it's always existed. It's just that no one is paying attention. And so rehoming is tied in with that, obviously, because it's very much the same conversation. But the rehoming tends to be about transferring guardianship and not necessarily about just warehousing them till they're 18 and then saying, figure it out.
So actually somebody just posted a question that ties in to the next thought I had written down. So her question is, what document do adoptive parents sign to turn the children over to these places? I heard you mention $2,000 to $17,000 per month, if I heard you correctly.
Well, the one in Jamaica is started off as 2,500. I think it's a little bit more now, but the reason why out of country facilities are attractive is they're much cheaper than the US. The 17,000 is what California is paying to specific facilities based upon some information that I've developed. And so there's, when you're talking about Christian private facilities, it might be 5,000, so it's a big range, but they're basically just signing, that they're giving power of attorney or guardianship or custody to the program. And that allows the program to make all decisions, which is on the one hand a good thing if they ever need medical attention or something else, and it is also used as a way to be able to, in my view, escape some legal responsibilities, like what we discovered when we went to try to get one of the young ladies out of Jamaica.
So in this example where California is paying $17,000 a month, is that child in custody or like
that's an adopted child. So they're using AAP funds, adoption assistance program funds, to whatever counties, because it's county-based system. So certain counties are using their funds to do this rather than community-based programming or keeping the child in the home and supporting the child in the home. And they're very well me. I do believe that there's always a small percentage of youth, very high needs youth, that may need higher levels of care. But the youth that I'm working with are nowhere near that.
One of the other things that came to mind for me hearing you talk is we used to run a mentoring program for teens in foster care who'd been in care for a long time and kind of, had lost contact with all the people that had cared for them over the years and moved homes frequently. And one of the things that we would very sadly see happen every once in a while is that one of the teens would go AWOL. And our child welfare agency here in Cleveland would often respond by discharging them from custody rather than looking for them or trying to
Yes.
find them. And, you can just imagine where they end up,
And when you mentioned mentoring, just like foster youth who are aging out, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, and I'm trying to create informal and at some point more formal networks of support around the country among adoptees where they have no one to turn to. And sometimes like one of the youth called me and said, "What are taxes?" Um, just very because they missed out on 5 years of their life in an institutional religious outside of the country, that the things that I take that we take for granted. And so they are as much in need of supportive adults in their life to help cheer them on, say, you can pass the GED, or this is how you sign up for a GED. And so I find myself doing just very rudimentary, tasks sometimes for them, but that's what's needed. And so I do believe mentorship in this space is also so needed for adoptees who've lost contact with everyone.
relationships can be healing, right?
Yes, exactly.
So we had a really important question that I also wondered, were our biological parents ever considered or contacted as these adoptions are getting broken and given the chance to, potentially reconnect, become a significant person, maybe get custody back at some point? I've seen
So
situations like
in
that, not quite
yeah,
as dramatic
in
as
it
what you're talking about.
yeah, in a typical broken adoption, when I'm just working in the States, for example, I have definitely been part of cases where biological families or parents stepped back up, and a very odd situation would occur where they would take custody as a stranger of their biological child. And so because and every state's different in terms of restoration of parental rights. And so in New York, for example, you can only do restoration of parental rights pre-adoption. And so that's for, what might be considered a legal orphan, not post-adoption. And so that's not a remedy, but certainly one of the youth, one of the original three in Jamaica, did end up going back to his biological mother. However, it was very informal and he was kind of just dumped there. And so for the institutionalized youth, that's not something I've encountered as much as I have just in regular practice.
And how does the um, Adoptee Citizenship Act interplay with what you're talking about? What's the intersection there?
So this is something that by no means I'm an expert in. I was actually very concerned that if I began pulling US CIS files, the United States Citizen and Immigration Services files, that of when they originally came into the country, that I might actually, alert them for possible, authorities that might result in negative consequence. But there is an adoption attorney in Minnesota. I'm sure everyone's familiar with it, Gregory Luce. And I spoke to him briefly about this, who said that, it should not be an issue if I were to order their files. But I'm in the process of beginning to obtain these files. However, I think that there is definitely a risk. And in the current climate, when I say a risk that maybe all the paperwork was not filed. After 2001, it seemed like we had a more streamlined system to be able to get the certificate of citizenship, but I don't know if that's guaranteed. And so I remain very concerned that since 2001, while we're seeing older adoptees who never received their citizenship now get deported, I am concerned of any impact on this younger group of adoptees. And that's something I'm currently in the midst of exploring, and I'm certainly by no means an expert in. But I think that we have to be very cognizant of the fact that that may not occur. Also, speaking of biological families, in one case that I'm working on now is that we are looking for his biological family in the country of origin. And so he, he doesn't know the language anymore. It's been too many years, but that connection is still really important. And so we're working with an organization who's doing this for pro bono, who's actually looking for his biological family and parents who we believe is alive.
When you say we, do you have other people in your?
I would say volunteers, and when I say we, it was more this pro
Yeah,
bono
right, yeah.
search organization.
Oh,
Certainly, I am always, and if there are lawyers on the call, I am looking for lawyers to be able in every state. One thing that I'm looking to do, and this may become more public in the next month or so, but for those abandoned adoptees, is pursuing possible cases against adoptive parents as well as against state or county systems that were involved at the time that they were sent to these abusive programs. And what I should say that from the beginning, for those original 7 boys that have been removed, is that every one of them, uh, one system had been involved with them, whether it was special education, delinquency through diversion, or a child protection investigation that had been initiated, and then the boys were sent away. And so that was really striking to me, how many systems knew that this was happening and didn't do anything or take any other action. So I'm also exploring partnerships with local attorneys in every state, who, obviously pro bono, to be able to assist in, and these would be pretty novel cases. For example, like an intentional infliction of emotional distress type case, and seeing what we can do on an accountability level using the law as well, since state systems have not stepped forward to hold themselves or adoptive parents accountable.
so when you say positions for attorneys, like volunteer attorneys, that would be like a practicing attorney who maybe volunteers at legal aid, like a part-time
Right. And it might
thing.
be, and sometimes, I recently had someone assist me where we needed guardianship transferred. And so they represented the new guardian in making sure that the paperwork was finalized, and we were dealing with 2 different states. But, this was another family member who stepped forward, really wanted to do the right thing. And so it's a variety of circumstances where attorneys can be helpful. It might not be a massive case like the ones I'm thinking about. It can be, sometimes just very quick things just to assist these young people.
So the case, yeah, okay. So we only have a few minutes left, but I want to get solution oriented. You talked
Yes.
about a lot of solutions, some of which maybe have had a little bit of success, some of which sounds like maybe didn't get traction. We did have a question from somebody in the audience asking, in your opinion, what needs to happen before a parent adopts to try to prevent this outcome from occurring?
So,
Counseling, better preparation, more consequences, accountability.
and again, this is very different in every state, but one of the recommendations that I made in New York at one point about, for example, because the push is so much about getting adoptions finalized because of the timeframes with ASFA and the penalties that can be imposed if we don't follow that, is, I think that blinds a lot of people in pushing forward on adoptions, that may not be really, because what we want to talk about is unconditional commitment. And I am shocked at how many adoptive parents who, dump their kid. And I actually did a court hearing on this in New York where they said they had no idea of the diagnosis or the medications. And I just don't know how that's possible. So it's about, one, educating about the child themselves, but also general education. So in many states, you don't have continuing education after you pass the first foster parent training, or there's no additional training if you become pre-adoptive. So I think there's a lot of training that should be required, but also if there are red flags, if they put in a 10-day notice to have their child removed and then revoked it and said, all right, I'll go forward on the adoption, well, maybe we should have an assessment at that point. Or if the child was psychiatrically hospitalized, maybe we should have an assessment. Do they understand the needs, and are they unconditionally committed to this child? And the pushback I got on that was, we can't ask too much of people because then they won't foster or adopt. And so then it's about numbers, not about quality. And I really think there's so much more that we can do around quality.
You mentioned the 30% number of kids in these institutions. My prior career was in child mental health before I started Adoption Network. And just on a regular inpatient unit with teens, we saw about 20% of them were adopted. But at that point, I was very aware that the more deeper levels of care that you get, the higher percentage. And I made it a habit to ask because I was shocked at how little attention this was receiving. This was back in the 80s and early 90s.
It should be a standard question.
Yeah.
I absolutely believe. The problem with child welfare too is that different names, different identification numbers. And so then they're not caught.
Yeah, when they come back in. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, I would ask like colleagues that I knew at residential treatment centers, what percentages, or even schools for kids with learning disabilities, and it's 50, 60%. That's anecdotal, but
yeah.
So Lori has her hand up, and we're gonna have to make it kind of quick because
okay, I'll make it quick. Thanks,
okay,
Betsy.
thanks.
And Don, thank you so much for your work in this area. I am an adoptive parent. And I agree that there are those people out there, like when the going gets tough, the not tough look for the exit. But I also think that adoptive parents are not a monolith, like none of us are. And I work also with people who, like at a systemic level, we have the idea that adoption is win-win. And there's, love them like your own, and the expectations are set like here. So some of, I think what you're seeing is because the expectation and the reality, there's such a gap.
Definitely.
And then another subset would be just people who families who can't keep everybody in their home safe. And there is a dearth of functioning, healthy, affordable ways to treat the whole family. Like, it's just really hard. So I just don't want anybody to leave here
definitely
vilifying.
True. And certainly when I've seen child on child abuse, and there are certain situations where it's not safe, but there's got to be better ways than just dumping one of the kids. And that's my point. And so, yes, I've been and I want to be anti-adoptive parents as well, because I recognize that there are real struggles. And that's why there's such a need for more. We can't just say, and this is not only an issue for the system, but also adoptive parents who no longer want to deal with the system or anything else and say we're fine, and then when it's too, when they come back, it's too late. But more support all around. And I should also say family-based support, because so often the focus is on the adopted child when it needs to be also on the dynamic with the adoptive parents, and people aren't looking at themselves as part of the issue, but I think that you have to look at it from a holistic perspective.
Absolutely. I second that, third that, fourth that.
So I'm going to type my email in real quick. I'm happy to schedule conversations with people, and if you can provide, feel free to reach out to me. I want to create, formal and informal connections all over. And if you can support the organization and the work that we're doing, emergency needs, I'm currently housing a young person in a hotel while we try to get her to a trafficking shelter. And that's a lot out of my pocket while I wait for grants, or decisions on grants. So please keep in contact. Please, I've created all over social media or LinkedIn, and, help spread the word around all of this and the significant issues. And if you can help, then let's find a way, to be able to work together around these issues.
Well, thank you, Don. I did see people, and I'll make sure that you get the chat. I'll copy it for you so that you don't miss anything. But I did see people asking how they can help. So it sounds like you've got roles for attorneys.
I have lots.
and attorneys as well. So That's really good. I'm glad to hear that. This is our final Monday evening speaker series before we break for summer. Speaking of summer, I wanted to mention Ty is in the background tonight because here in Cleveland it's been 100 degrees all day, and we're close to it, and we've kind of got a brownout in certain areas, so Ty is kind of limited internet. But we made it work. We did put a survey in the chat. It's just real quick. You can let us know what you think about this evening, and then also ideas that you might have for the future. Adoption Network Cleveland is a nonprofit organization, so you can click through to adoptionnetwork.org and see more about us. And if we're a membership-based organization, if you'd like to join, hopefully it's real clear on our website how to do that. And we provide lots of different programming, so you can check that out while you're there as well. So thank you for attending, and we'll call it a night. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.